We are always very happy to host lectures in partnership with VitrA and grateful for them to come here and offer the support. This partnership with VitrA has explored wide-ranging survey of topics, projects, and innovative ideas about the way people are thinking, rethinking the relationship between the built environment and society. It has seen a diverse range of thought-provoking lectures and discussions featuring emerging and established international voices within architecture. And this collaboration reflects a shared commitment to add social, economical, and cultural value to society, inspiring audiences both in person and across the UK, as well as internationally. Some of these lectures are available online, and if you check the RIBA+VitrA page on architecture.com, you can look back over the many great talks we have hosted together over the past 5 years. Throughout 2023, the program Forms of Exchange has invited a range of voices who are leading the way with new processes and practices that are redefining placemaking and the architectural profession. We have been sharing the conversation around how architecture as a practice and a profession is shifting. We have seen leading practitioners and architects that are building structures rooted in place, shaped by the context, with values such as integrity at the heart of it. Our penultimate event in the program invites a dynamic group of individuals to the stage, all of who are working to create spaces that are meaningful, diverse, inclusive, supportive, and enriching to those that use the places. We will discover more about their approach and work and how it better serves those people that use their spaces. It's a real pleasure to be welcoming Jayden Ali, Dr. Julia King, Akil Scafe-Smith to the panel conversation. We also are grateful to have here with us Dr. Torange, who will be helping us facilitate the discussion tonight. The format of which will begin with Dr. Torange, who will introduce the topic and this evening's speakers, after which each speaker will give a short presentation and insight to their work, and we'll then together discuss themes and any common encounters through their work, which also will be an opportunity for you guys to ask your questions. So who is Dr. Torange? She is a co-founder and director of urbanism, public art, and architecture at the practice Public Works. Public Works have been around since 2004. They are an interdisciplinary practice working on co-production using methods such as art, architecture, urbanism, systems thinking, and citizenship. Torange has 23 years in academic teaching and research in architecture and design. She's currently teaching on a suite of postgraduate and doctoral courses she wrote called Design for Cultural Commons at London Metropolitan University. She's also a course leader, as well as teaching in leading units at the Royal College of Art. And she's a visiting professor at Barbican and Guildhall School of Music and Drama. She has taught at international universities such as UMA School of Architecture in Sweden, and is currently visiting professor at the International University of Barcelona on the MA Emergency Architecture. Torange delivered a TED Talk on harnessing the power of civic commons. She recently completed being a consultant on the 5-year framework for the Mayor of London's Specialist Assistant Team for community engagement in regeneration. She's a chartered designer and an expert advisor for Design Council. She has been invited to be one of the 9 experts on the Design Council's initiative called the Design for Planet Fellowship. So now, what I would like to do is hand over to Torange, who will introduce the subject. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope you have an enjoyable evening.
Hi, everyone. So, welcome. Thank you for being here, and delighted to have so many of you here and our peers in a way in this. Looking forward, and thank you to VitrA, and thank you to the RIBA for hosting this. So I'd like to just very briefly, because we want to get and listen to our speakers, just set the context around tonight's topic, collective collaborations, by almost kind of separating these two concepts, the collectivism and also the collaboration. They share a common ground in both nurturing social relationships and operating in the sphere of social impact and potentially social change. This is an important discussion as we have reached peak individualism, as Cobb and Carroll wrote almost 3 decades ago, that extreme individualism can be linked to several forms of social pathology, such as high crime, emotional stress, physical and mental health, and notions of isolation. And today, we probably can recognize some of that. So actually starting to think about types of practices that bring together individualism and collectivism, so you're not completely giving up the idea of the self, because you have to be self-empowered in order to empower others, is really, really important. I'm also going to just say a couple of words from Harry Triandis, who's a psychologist and an organizational psychologist, in his book Individualism and Collectivism, where he describes collectives as being horizontal or vertical. And this has been really important in our practice, public works, because when you start to have collectives, whether you're making them within communities or whether you're making them as an organizational form, they are a project in themselves that are constantly being produced and reproduced in kind of conversation with others. And I suppose as architects, we're also really interested in systems. So, but we don't talk about governance so much, but we think governance means kind of just being legally formed. But it's not just about that. There is a cultural governance, which is part of that. So the horizontal collectivism is a place where relationships still have interdependency. There's still relationships as such. But the personal interests are allowed to live. Whereas in the vertical one, there are more ideologically potentially based, where the individual need is sometimes not discussed because it's all about the collective endeavor. I'm not saying any of them are right or wrong, they're just part of the understanding when we start to design these. So collectives can be more than places of practice as business. They can become an important concept for developing collectivity in the city, whose production and sustainability can take years. So our challenge as architects is how can we financially sustain these continuous collectivities in the city in order to deploy architecture politically to change political arenas within the neighborhoods and the city. And in a very small way, I'll talk about collaboration as well. Because again, there is a real confusion sometimes between the collaboration is not coordination, which is about organization of parties to realize work towards a set goal. It is also not just cooperation, where we agree to share knowledge, goal, positioning, which all creates a rather thin interpersonal relationship rather than a deep, thick one, which collaboration could be about. We need both of those, coordination and cooperation, to collaborate more deeply. But it is much more a space where it is about relationship building, about disagreeing, about learning and unlearning, building trust, and engaging in shifting power relations. These are easier said than done, as we will see probably with our amazing speakers tonight. So finally, collaboration as social relations is a place where relearning, agreeing to be wrong, and negotiating and renegotiating the self and the collective comes to play. And the question I hope we will get to discuss in the discussion is how we deploy architecture to this political paradigm and build collaborative collectives. And so that's enough from me. I'm going to introduce Jayden Ali to speak about his practice, and I'm just going to do a quick bio. Jayden is an architect, artist, and filmmaker whose interdisciplinary practice, JA Projects, works internationally in public-facing cultural projects that strengthen communities and actively reflect on society. He's a lecturer at Central St. Martin's, is a trustee of Open City, and a design advocate for the Mayor of London. He has been recognized by numerous publications as a key voice shaping the life of cities, and is an Architects Journal's prestigious 40 under 40 list. He is part of Hackney Regeneration Design Advisory Group and sits on the London Legacy Development Corporation Quality Review Panel. Jayden is the co-curator of the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2023, and he is an alumni of the Architectural Association, the CAS, and the University of East London. So please clap, put your hands together for Jayden.
Hi. Okay. I'm not going to stand here. I'm going to pace and walk and talk. It's really nice to be with you this evening. That was a really wonderful introduction and really got the juices flowing, especially this idea of the collective being a project in itself. And so the work I'm going to talk about is very much a collective endeavor. I lead a practice called JA Projects. It's a collective endeavor, so none of this stuff exists without these people. We're actually a little bit more than these people, but these people are behind everything we do. And I think it's really important to start with them, because to produce projects that support and cherish and nurture collectives and collaborations, you need to be really conscious of the environment in which you're seeking to do that and the people you're collaborating with. And I feel incredibly blessed to collaborate alongside these people every single day. But also that the network of collaboration is much bigger than the studio itself. I call us Architects Plus because for the most part, everybody in the studio has some other thing that they do, whether they are broadcasters or work or kind of in urban greening, or they work for other kind of social agencies. They're producing other stuff, and that means the network of collaboration and those feedback loops is bigger. I'm going to talk through just 3 projects that exist at different scales, but the commonality between all of these projects is that we're concerned with culture. The reason we're concerned with culture is because we're concerned with cities. I think in terms of my own practice, my interest in architecture is born from, and it was really interesting listening to you speak, Torange, is born from this idea of an individual pursuit. I'm trying to work out what my relationship is to the world around me. And therefore, by extension, on that journey, I've realized that much of the spaces that we occupy and the spaces that we construct are not necessarily reflective and supportive of my experience. And I don't necessarily think that my experience is a rare experience. If you think of London, and 40% of London, of the population of London are non-white, that's not an exclusive experience to me. And so therefore, by extension, the practice is concerned with how we can nurture and cherish and reflect and support the experience of others who have a similar experience to myself. So in order to do that, what we really want to do is support the way that people interact, the way that people make, the stories they tell, the rituals they engage with, and which is why we have this kind of overarching cultural lens that influences all of the projects in the practice. And it extends across a number of scales, from the ideas of cultural production, which might be kind of objects and artifacts and kind of filmmaking or poetry or other types of storytelling, to cultural framing and our work with institutions and how we support other people to tell certain stories. And to the infrastructure of cultural production. So not only are we seeking to represent and support people's cultural production and the stuff that they make, but we're also seeking to help them make more of that. So it's kind of an immediate medium, but also supportive of them to produce more. And so these 4 projects span those scales. So if we're thinking about cultural production, we're really talking about, in this instance, our work for the British Pavilion in Venice, and specifically the work that sits, the sculptural work that sits outside, called Thunder and Shimshek. And this commission, when we were thinking about the framing for the pavilion, which is really about celebrating the rituals of black and brown people in Britain, I was confronted with this moment where I had to engage with my past. And I have this inherited culture that I've inherited from my parents, but I'm dislocated from it. And it goes back to that moment where I said it's a kind of an individual reflection that I don't think that that experience is an exclusive experience to me. I think that experience of being a 3rd-generation immigrant is a common experience that exists in London. However, I really know my Turkish Cypriot heritage, and I know less my Trinidadian heritage. And for me, that was an opportunity. Always in the practice, we're looking for opportunities, and we're looking at the process as the project, not just the output. And so, as part of this process, I was really lucky enough to befriend Harun Shah on the right and Cyril Kamai on the left. Cyril is 96 years old, and he is the inventor of the first polyphonic steel pan. This is the steel pan that has all of the various notes on it in which you can play a tune. Up until then, it was just kind of bin lids and biscuit tins with singular or a couple of notes. And my ambition there was to work alongside them to really gather the courage, but also the knowledge to do them justice, to do their histories justice and project that on the global scale. So the way in which we collaborated was very much through working together, through just talking, through them being able to tell their stories, through collaboratively writing journal articles. And then there was this really beautiful moment where we produced a prototype of the steel pans that hang in Venice at the moment, which is to close in a week's time. And the first people to play those pans were Cyril and Harun. And for me, that was incredible because it was a moment just the day before these objects were to be shipped, and they were to be shipped to another country and an island territory surrounded by water. And that moment held all of the resonance of their travel to the UK, my ancestors' travel to the UK, and the discourse between Cyprus and Trinidad and Britain. And I think that's, as an introduction to the practice, is an acute one, because we're not necessarily concerned with some form of collaboration that exists in a suite of post-it notes. It's not how we feel people can engage with the process of city making. We feel that it's not necessarily about collaborating with people to enable them to access the tools that we have, although that is a byproduct, but it's more about honoring the tools that they already have, to recognize that they already engage in the process of city making. Haroon is a carnival leader in West London. He is integral to his community, and he contributes to what it is to be in West London at that time. So I'm just going to flip through some of these slides. They follow a similar format in which you can see some of the process and you can see some of the output, and that's the sculpture work hanging in Venice at this moment. Just briefly, we've been working on this project for Queen's Market and Queen's Square, which is in Newham. And again, we worked on this project from the position that we must produce gateways in which people can engage with the future of the site in which they are already heavily invested, recognizing that they make Queen's Market what Queen's Market already is. And how can we make our work for Queen's Market reflective of their activity and supportive of it? And so on the right is the kind of wider scheme for Queen's Market. We held various different occupations across the site at different times of the day with different people, with different focus. And on this instance, it was very much about occupying the square and what activities could take place. But then on the right-hand side, you see a kind of a very draft image of the square as it kind of evolves, but also that the collaboration is not necessarily one where one is always in dialogue. There are traces of people's existence that exists beforehand. And so we always wanted to riff on the incredible textures and the patterns and the patina of Queen's Market already as kind of the resonant tone of their contribution to the city and our collaboration with that. This is a project for Red Church Street, which is kind of a slightly bigger scale, which is kind of looking at the neighborhood scale. And what we really wanted to do here was to start to put together a vision for future development. If you know, Red Church Street is quite an elitist street on the corner of East London where the Bengali community don't necessarily have a stake or engage. And we see, as I said, we see the project, the process as the project, not as much as the outcome. So we put together a series of events where we invited people to take part. But one thing we did do is we connected St. Hilda's, which is a community institution that just on the periphery on Red Church Street and has a kind of an empty ground floor, with Otijo, who is a Bengali women's kitchen. And we done that because we wanted to make connections between them, but we also wanted to test what it would be to have a food offering on the street for St. Hilda's. It would be supportive for St. Hilda's as an institution, and it would be supportive for Otijo. And on the right-hand side, you can see some of the visioning illustrations that we put together and some of the stories that we tell. But I think maybe as a final slide, this is a picture of Otijo. Through our introduction to St. Hilda's and through the process of the project, Otijo had a permanent residency in St. Hilda's, was contributing to St. Hilda's and the economy of Red Church Street, in as much as Red Church Street was contributing to their existence as well. And that collaboration has been so successful that Otijo are about to take up residency in the bottom of Rich Mix. And if you think back to this visioning exercise where we're trying to connect Rich Mix with the mosque and St. Hilda's and the primary school, that result is already a manifestation of our ambition. I'm going to leave it there. I'm 25 seconds over time. Thank you very much.
Now I'm going to introduce Dr. Julia King from LSE Cities. She trained as an architect, and her research, design practice and teaching focuses on infrastructure and public space in the context of youth engagement, inequitable infrastructure development and urban microcultures. She's the founder and director of the apprenticeship program in city design and researcher in residence at LSE Cities. She has taught previously at the AA, LSE, UCL and UAL. She has won numerous awards for her work, including Emerging Women Architects of the Year, NLA Award, Civic Trust Regional Award, and shortlisted for a Deutsche Bank Urban Age Award. Recently, her work has been recognized as best practice on a European-wide basis at the recent Eurocities Awards as an example of how young people can lead the way in designing inclusive solutions to local needs. Her projects have been widely published, and she has authored chapters in various books, such as Home Economics and Infrastructure Space. Please welcome Dr. Julia King.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's a real honor to be here and to talk alongside friends and colleagues. And sorry, I'm going to squeeze in a little bit more. Thank you for that introduction. I've been working at LSE Cities for about 8 years, and I'm going to show you a little bit about one project, not three, and it's my work with young people, particularly young women. But before I do that, just to give you a little bit of context about me and who I am, and I guess me as an individual. So my background is in architecture, and I sort of had a really early midlife crisis, I think, and after I sort of left university, and ended up doing a PhD to appease that midlife crisis. And when I'm going to go off piece. When I was doing my PhD, I was really interested I was working in the edge of Delhi in a very sort of poor area, and started through a sort of longest journey designing and building infrastructure, which you can see here. And what ties this to my recent work is that across the board, all my work is actually fundamentally interested in working with people who are sort of traditionally absent or excluded from sort of planning and the built environment, whether that be women accessing toilets in the context of India, or if it's young people on the edge of London. And if we move to the next slide, during the pandemic, I was sort of cut off from my work in India and started thinking about, well, what am I going to do that I can do from home? And actually, I started working with Akil on this project. We'd been working together in Brent, working with young people, and got together. We'd had this idea of how brilliant would it be to take some of the young people and actually locate them within the LSE. And so I set up what is now the Apprenticeship in City Design, which effectively hires and trains young people to come into the space of an institution like the LSE, and in this case, well over a 2-year period, actually design a real piece of public space. And you can see that we commissioned a graphic novel to tell that story. And it was at this time that I just started really thinking about, if my interest is about how local people can be part of local projects, it's also an interest about how local people can be part of local knowledge production and how that can inform how spaces are made. And in an academic environment, that's an interest in peer research. And so peer research is effectively a way of working which recognizes that individuals within any community are capable themselves of being competent agents of participating in research at a variety of levels. And there's some sort of other quotes there. But and when I was thinking about this way of working, which weirdly is an anathema in universities, not weirdly for anyone who's in one, what really the framework that I found so useful to interrogate all of my work is Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. And Sherry Arnstein was this amazing academic, sort of in the 60s, where it was very technocratic and planning was sort of very top-down. And she developed this ladder, which basically says that there's these degrees, these rungs of participation, which go from manipulation and therapy and all the way up where you ideally want to be to citizen control. And because for her, and thinking about Torange, your introduction, participation without power is actually a very disempowering place to be. And I'm going to revisit this ladder at the end, But in order to do this kind of thing of peer research, I actually, before I could do the project, had to think of the institutional form by which I could execute this vision of bringing young people on an equitable, safe place as effectively my employees. And so, and it was sort of interesting for me because LSE Cities has the history of it as a research department is inextricably linked to the pedagogy that it offers. So the MSc was part of a program that really framed what LSE Cities did as an institution. This idea that we could have sociologists and architects in a room and that space and society are inextricably linked. And so I have this, I think maybe a failed vision of this idea that of what it would look like to bring young people, or anyone really, into these two dual programs. If the apprenticeship in city design is about designing public spaces, the research and residence model is about producing research. So it's this kind of like local designs versus local knowledge. And I have started in asking this kind of peer research question. I've teamed up, a lot of my work has been teaming up with a really fantastic charity called Make Space for Girls. And one of the things that's given me is this sort of a question that we've been exploring throughout these projects. And this is research that they've done. And why I think it's really powerful is that if you look at sort of teenage provision for public space, 90% roughly, and there's a sort of some data backing that up, of teenage provision, this is sort of a public, often a statutory obligation to teenagers, is in the form of MUGAs, which is multi-use game areas. And if you actually ask young people what they want, the MUGA actually is really not that popular. It's definitely not popular for girls, and it's actually not even popular for boys. So you can see the multi-use areas hanging in the middle there. What teenagers want, I remember a very long time ago when I was a teenager, but yeah, they want swings, they want trampolines, they want play and adventure equipment. But we're sort of trapped into this kind of funnel of just providing these actually really terrible spaces. And I was once interviewing a young boy who sort of articulated that as a young man, he should be in a cage. I think what a terrible vision we're giving our young people. And so I think we all intuitively know, anyone who works in the public sector knows we're really letting our young people down, and it has having devastating impacts on their health and well-being. And so we know we need to make change happen. There's loads of things that we need to do. Fundamentally, we need to center the voices of teenagers in this. And that's about in research, it's about in the solutions, and in advocating for change. That's part of the sort of co-design, the framing of why we're all here today. I would like to caution about the girl effect. There's so much out there, Nike adverts that are saying we can fix this by empowering young women without thinking of any of the structural conditions by which young women are feeling disempowered in the first place. And there's huge structural stuff that we need to tackle. It's not just about local plans, it's also about knowledge, it's also about risk aversion, and fundamentally about seeking equity and not equality. And there's these sort of also huge issues around sexism that we're still dealing with, annoyingly. I read these books that were done in the 80s, and it's like nothing's changed. It's really frustrating. And I think finally, there are probably groups of you who are going, oh, the binary isn't great though, is it? I agree with you. It really isn't great. And how most people experience the world isn't in this binary of girl and boy, thinking of that slide that I had before you. But the Equalities Act is. And that is actually my singular big critique of the Equalities Act, is that it sees the world through this binary, and it isn't intersectional enough. But until the Equalities Act changes, which I really hope it does, right now this binary helps me articulate that need for change through that legal framework. Because effectively, when you have data that says that young girls disproportionately or actually do not use MUGAs, you are then using public funds in a discriminatory way, and that is a breach of the Equalities Act. So until the Equalities Act changes, I think, and I'm happy to have this discussion, I waver on it almost on a daily basis, but I think this lens, this gendered lens, is a really useful one. So what have I been doing with that? I've got 6 minutes. We have, with these two schemes, we're effectively up and running in all of these, 4 and 3? Yeah, 7. Seven sites throughout the UK. Mostly I pick my sites looking at places that are getting levelling up money, or high street town centre regeneration funds, and so on and so on. And the Crewe and Trowbridge, slightly different funding, probably ignore that. Across the board, I think we've hired, so I've hired in the past year and a half about 42, I think, or 43 young people, and then done additional surveys. And so that effectively means across these sites, we've had 42 people who've been hired as my employees within the LSE. And across those projects, some of them are 2 years, some of them less than that, some of them a couple of months, but they're all underpinned by two critical principles. The idea that young people need to be paid for their labor when participating genuinely in the production of local plans and local knowledge. And the second one is that there has to be a learning component. And you talked about learning and unlearning, is that fundamentally really poor community engagement, that sort of do you prefer A or B, that's really poor because the terms of that debate have not been shared. I don't know if I prefer A or B because I don't know what's at stake. And so this idea that I fundamentally believe that any form of good engagement has to include a degree of learning so that you are empowered with the decision-making of what's at stake, what is possible, and what isn't. And so underneath those two principles, there's these sort of four things that I do within each of the sites. And one is that we develop a bespoke curriculum. The curriculum has to be bespoke because the issues in Crewe are completely different to the issues in Clapham. And there's this thing of unlearning and learning, because particularly if we're talking about, let's say, violence towards women, at a very young age, and actually young people in general, normalize a huge amount of violence towards them. So if we want to talk and have trust and explore these issues, we have to unlearn assumptions about how we live. Then there's this thing of like weekly discussions, and Akil, I'm thinking about our conversations around valuing tacit knowledge and how important that is. And Torange, what you were saying about trust. Trust gets built slowly and over time, and you've got to work at it pretty hard. We ask our young people to conduct work because they are being paid and they are my colleagues, so you need to work. So they do independent research activities. And sometimes we use things like Instagram, and this is about reading the everyday. And then fundamentally, we produce these sort of maps which are about claiming space. I'm beginning to run out of time, so I'm going to speed through what some of this research looks like, because some of it is things that we all probably can imagine, things like safety issues. So these are photographs taken by a young researcher in Clapham, and here she's talking about how, actually this is on the back of Sarah Raj, and she's like, why is there still such poor lighting? There's the obvious thing around facilities and how terrible they are. And actually, this is a pretty good MOOCA. I need to change the slide. This is a pretty good MOOCA. Most of them are entirely enclosed. And here are some of the articulations of saying, there's nothing stopping us going through the gates, but we don't feel we should. And I think this is such an important quote for architects, because to exclude people from spaces, it's quite easy to do it. And young people in particular are really attentive to environments that are designed for them or not for them. And one of the things that we've landed on is this idea of judgment. And we really, there's a lot of research around judgment. This slide is not showing. This is a slide about, about the kinds of research there is. It's a quote taken from a GLA, which basically talks about how teenagers, there's this sort of moral panic around teenagers. We don't know what to do with them. They're in this really weird age between being in, sort of having your parents take you out and then being adults. And again, there's meant to be some things, I should check all of these slides, but what we found is that judgment is actually spatialized across these various scales, from the bench to the playground to the high street. And these things manifest themselves in various ways. The bench that is too small for the female body. The playground that has signs explicitly saying do not be there, and the young mums who will tut at girls who are talking, or young people in general who are talking too loudly. And the high street where you get looked at or actually sexualized on a daily basis. And so it's in this context that if we zoom into the bench, benches are a fundamental, and I think really important, this idea to repose in public life. And but actually this bench is very telling. We all know that this bench isn't for young people. This bench is for an elderly couple to sit and spend their time. And it's also not a very appealing bench for young people. And I think one of the things is that, so in the quote here is like, yeah, this isn't for us in Crewe. And I think there's a real, what I'm trying to say here is that how we design spaces can really, I don't think you can design sexism out, but I do think you can design it in. So when we don't consider that something like judgment can actually be spatialized, we end up producing spaces where people fundamentally feel like they don't want to be there. So I've touched on I did that sort of small nugget of judgment, but what have we concluded? Fundamentally, young people I actually want really basic things. They just want public solutions that work better for everyone. I mean, that's one of the other things too, and I guess this is a sort of tenet of feminist theory, is that the feminist lens is inherently an inclusive one, and again, we can debate that. But they want to design girls into public spaces without designing boys out. They fundamentally want amenities and youth facilities that better cater for them. And yeah, they want toilets, shock horror. You know, austerity has had a devastating impact on our public lives. And there's this awful history of actually not providing toilets for women as a way to keep women in the home, our history of that. And we're really coming back to that. I think we've lost a huge amount of our public toilets, something like 50%. And yeah, it's a pretty basic, essential need. And so I really look forward to a time when our public life is more valued. And they want better safety parameters. But fundamentally, they want to be considered. And that is a political project. And I think just as my last kind of throw, given that we're in the RIBA and I felt compelled to do this, if you recall that Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation, inherently, the RIBA stages of work kind of keeps engagement in the stages 1 and 3, and actually, fundamentally, by design, will result in quite tokenistic gestures towards engagement. And I think architecture firms are beginning to really push back on these firms. That sort of, this was at a talk, I reproduced this slide from a talk that I went to as DSDHA, where they were saying, what would it look like if participatory process drove the RIBA stages of work? And it would look a lot more like that than like this. And I know this is a reductive one of the RIBA, but it's my last provocation. And finally, I really just wanted to locate the voices of one of the many young women we've worked with, which said, I want public spaces to make each and every young person feel comfortable, like they fit in, not worrying about, am I meant to be here? Is this a space for me? That they all fit in some type of way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So, last but not least, Akil. So Akil is a director of Resolve Collective alongside Seth Scafe-Smith and Melissa Hanif, an interdisciplinary design collective that combines architecture, engineering, technology, and art to address social challenges. The collective has delivered numerous projects, workshops, publications, and talks in the UK and across Europe. Much of their work aims to provide platforms for the production of new knowledge and ideas, whilst collaborating and organizing to help resilient communities. For them, design encompasses both physical and systemic interventions, exploring ways of using project sites as a resource and working with different communities as stakeholders in the short and long-term management projects. For Resolve, design carries more than aesthetic value. It is also a mechanism for political, socioeconomic change. So I would like to welcome Akil, and please put your hands together for Akil.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm going to try and be as rapid as humanly possible. I want to start by thanking actually Julia and Jayden, who I owe a great deal to in my career. They both took a chance on me very deep into my work, and I really wouldn't be here standing on this stage if it wasn't for them both. They're amazing practitioners, and the way that they've contributed to the field is fantastic, as you guys already know. So I'm going to speak a little bit about my work with Resolve, which is a collective. It's a design collective, as Torange said. We work between art, engineering, technology, and architecture as a way of addressing social issues. And this is my lovely team here, Resolve Collective. But first, and I think because if, like me, you are waking up these days feeling quite powerless, waking up these days feeling somewhat suffocated from the ongoing effects, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, then, like me, what you may need reminding of is a lineage of activism in which we all, as colonized people, come from. So, though architecture is one of our tools, it is not the only thing that has birthed the genealogy that has Resolve Collective. We come from a long line of black activists in South London, the Organisation for Women of African and Asian Descent, the Black Brixton Women's Group, the British Black Panthers, and also a long line in Caribbean thought, post-colonial Caribbean thought, Amy Cesar, Stuart Hall, Frantz Fanon, all of whom have stood in solidarity with Palestine, but also international struggle for the remit of colonized people across the world. This is something which manifests in all of our practices. This is something which manifests in all of our projects. And that is something which sticks to us and flows throughout the work, and that's what I had to say in order to introduce the project. So the work that we do revolves around this design philosophy that we call using the site as a resource. And for us, that means this idea of valuing and celebrating both local knowledge, but also local resources, local materials. That involves working with a number of different community stakeholders in long-term equitable approaches, but also means that the work manifests itself in lots of different ways. And so sometimes we're working on small and intimate kind of public-scale interventions. Other times we're working in large institutions. Sometimes we're working in a way in which we're trying to use design as a means of platforming. So we're platforming the work of others. And we exist in an ecology of practice, which is where that collective comes from. We came up in a Brixton which was bursting with energy and with organizations that were trying to better their own environment, ourselves included. We were trying to better the place that we were from. And so we came up in an inherently collaborative and actually, in fact, more a co-conspirator environment where we were all conspiring to try and change our realities, to try and change the built environments around us. We also use design as a means of thinking, so thinking through making is a really important part of how we work. And that means that the work manifests as an open process. We also work sometimes more openly within the architecture realm, and that's within strategies and master plans, but it's always as a way of including the voices of the people who exist in local spaces. Materials are a really important part for us because they tell a material history, they tell a political history, and we're able to trace lines of power through this idea of materials. Some of the work that we do exists in public spaces and can be there and is there beyond where we are, and some of the work exists in the digital sphere and a way in which we can publicize research and make that engaging and facilitating for those who are concerned. So the work can take lots and lots of different forms. It takes on lots and lots of different aesthetics, but ultimately it is around this idea of design as a process and, as I said, the site as a resource. So I want to go very quickly through our journey and then through two projects if I have time. And as I said, the journey that we took started in Brixton in 2016. We had just started as an organization and we're interested in this idea of local tacit knowledge. How could we work with the people around us to create a platform for speaking about radical new ideas? And so we came up with this idea of the Rebel Space Pavilion, which was a temporary design pavilion which was in St. Matthew's Church Gardens. We used a design constraint of only using materials that we could source from within a mile radius of the site. And actually, although now that sounds like a sexy new design kind of constraint, actually it's because we didn't have any money and we didn't have a car. So we only had one way of getting these things together, and that was with our hands. We were designing this space, and really, as well as the physical space, the idea was that we were trying to also design the program. So we're a programming space, not as a way of just activating something which was already there, but really a way of being synchronous in terms of how we move through those spaces. And so we were designing with time. We were really changing the nature of that space to make sure that there was a different artist exhibition every morning and a different film screening, party, etc. every evening. We continued to work in Brixton, and I cannot stress enough to you that during the first years of our careers, and actually the first time I came up to talk here was during the Stephen Lawrence lecture in 2018 or something, and at that point we had never done any work outside of Brixton. We had never left Brixton, never left South London, and we had no reason to, we had no need to do that. The second project that we did was in Brixton Market, and this project was looking at this idea of market value, the value of that markets bring to diasporic communities. Brixton Market, for all who know, is an important place and one of the epicenters in London of Afro-Caribbean identity. We were really interested in this idea of banana boxes and how the market dealers were using bananas boxes for everything other than bananas. They were using it for Gucci trainers, for water mitigation, for everything you can imagine. And this way in which they were using this flexible market infrastructure, we sought to turn into an internal armature, internal structure within an abandoned unit in the space. And so we created this space, which then platformed for a month, a number of different talks and workshops which explore this idea of market value and the diasporic power which shapes these sides of South London. Now, sometimes when I used to show these slides, and particularly this slide, I used to feel a bit nervous. And I'm now a honorary fellow at the Royal Institute of British Architects, and so that means sometimes I have to dumb down these slides. I can't show too many party slides because people aren't going to take me seriously. But actually, when I think about this slide, I think to myself that this space doesn't exist anymore. And in fact, there is no sign that this space has ever existed. If you were to go down here in Brixton right now, you'd find a prep. And actually, what this slide says to me is that it's about an archive, and that our practice has consistently been around creating spaces for Black joy in a city that consistently repackages that as a luxury. And so I really love these slides. I love the party slides, and we continue to make that a central part of the practice. We also work as a way of platforming, which is something that I said before, and this is the work of British-Nigerian artist Shola Olulade, who's an amazing artist, and whom we had the opportunity to share ours with and our space with her. And this was a really important way in which we continue to work, even as we became the artists within institutions. This all changed when we were working in Sheffield, and Sheffield is now a kind of sister city of ours. It's a place that we really hold dear to our practices and also to our hearts. We were inspired by the work of Kevin Lynch, who was a planner in the 60s and 70s, and really wanted to take this idea of the image of the city, but think through a cartographical means of working with the residents around Park Hill Estate and also within Manor and Castle, the local area. So working with the secondary schools and also with those groups, we came up with this idea of emotional mapping, a way of understanding people's contested and subjective understandings of the cities. And that was a way in which we could see a place that we had never been through other people's eyes. We then tried to use this as a way of building out. So we built an exhibition using the site, in this case, of the resource being a network of different artist ecologies across the city, begging, borrowing, and stealing different materials in order to build these places through which we tried to evince and to read people's emotional responses to Sheffield. We were looking at performance, we were looking at narrative in the city, we were interested in how people were moving, and Sheffield became our city. So Sheffield became this sister city of ours. So I'm going to go into one deep dive, maybe, if I have time. And this is just an example of also how we've continued along this journey of mapping. And actually, this is the project that we did with We Made That and also Croydon Council, by which we would turn this emotional map into a digital platform through which people could submit their memories and understandings of a place called Purley Way in Croydon that would feed into local policy. The project that I want to talk about is a project that is extremely close to my heart, and this is a project called Tools for Solidarity that we worked with the Mosaic Rooms in London, but also with Earls Court Youth Centre, which is an integral social infrastructure within West London, and 3 schools in Ramallah in Palestine. And so this project was the result of a series of workshops with the young people in both places, through which we were trying to understand this idea of solidarity. The young people we were working with, other than some of whom were quite old, some of whom were very young, and so there was varying understanding of what that meant to be in solidarity. Some young people had never even heard that word. So we were really, really interested in how we can create a series of processes by which we can understand that with our hands. How can we build and create together in a way that understands this concept materially and tangibly? And so we set aside a series of tasks by which we were going through with those young people, building from found materials, mapping as well, and mapping took on a really important stage within the context of Ramallah and the West Bank as well, where many of the young people that we were working with hadn't ever seen their homes on a map, and for obvious reasons. And so we were really interested in how that then worked out. This moved through into a design phase by which we were creating these tools with those young people and then building those out. And so the way that the young people were taking things from their local resources, we then sought inspiration from as a means of then building our eventual installation. All of the materials came from local spaces, all of the techniques came from the imaginations of those young people, and all of the processes we tried to leave open to be continued within the gardens of the mosaic rooms. It turned out into a huge DIY space of different open processes, some of which by which we were taking old materials from the mosaic rooms and stringing those up, allowing people to continue the work of the young people. Sometimes we were also thinking about reciprocity within the design process. So what does solidarity mean, not just as a symbolic design value, but actually as something which is baked into the method? We wanted to try and work in a way which reached out to social infrastructure in the local area and worked reciprocally with those materials. So we built a bookshelf for Brompton Library, gave that bookshelf to Brompton Library, and then took one of their old crusty bookshelves. And that was exhibited in the space. And so we were trying to think about ways in which we could show reciprocity with the organizations around us, with the organizations that sat in that vicinity with us. The space, as well as having a number of different installations, also platformed a series of lesson plans where we worked collaboratively with some of our favorite artists and organizers within this kind of wider ecology. People like Mohammed Salah from Bethlehem, like Space Black as well, who are an amazing British Sudani architectural group. People like Nia Fekri as well, who's a British-Iranian practitioner who's really amazing work. And we were able to cultivate a program that acted within the frameworks of creating a tangible solidarity, but also in ways that people could take home. So people could take home these methods, they could take home these pieces, and this was a vestige of some of that space. I've got 2 minutes and 50 seconds, so I'm going to go through one more. The second one is a project that we completed in Hamburg at the beginning of this year called Wasserbotschaften, which is an exhibition that we designed for the Mark Gallery. We were very lucky in order to be able to design this exhibition with a series of researchers such as Carolina Caicedo, who is one of my favorite artists. She's a Colombian artist that works a lot with communities around the Atrato River, with also Adenike Olodosu as well, and Jade Hill and Kelsey Leonard from the Great Lakes region. And so we were working with a series of researchers, as well as the curatorial team at the Mark, to think about this idea of water and the story that we can tell through water and the collection at the museum. We were also interested in acquiring activist materials. So from all across the world, the museum was acquiring activist materials, and we were exhibiting this within the space. We are interested, when we're designing, in many, many things, but one of which is this idea of the subplot. What are we doing that architecture becomes the excuse of? And I take that phrase from Jessica Carrera from Comunal Italia in Mexico, who uses this idea of architecture as an excuse. So if architecture or design is an excuse in our respect, what is the thing that we're trying to do? What is the subplot? And here it was to try and get to an understanding of a space in Hamburg called Wilhelmsburg, the series of islands in the Elbe River that flows through the city. This series of islands has a very long history of migration, people from all across the world who had been coming there for the last 2 centuries, and was also the stage for a catalytic event in 1962 called the Sturmflood, which flooded most of the city but affected most particularly a lot of the migrant population within Wilhelmsburg. We based ourselves from here whilst trying to design this exhibition and set aside a series of tasks by which we were mapping their understanding of local people and water, but also very interestingly thinking about how young people relate to these stories of water. So we worked really, really closely with the Stadtschule in Wilhelmsburg and also a series of young youth infrastructure. And we dug clay from the banks of the River Elbe and turned this into a series of workshops called Water Messages, by which we were trying to understand tangibly young people's connections with water. And we were told by the teachers, that these students wouldn't know nothing about water. These students don't even know that they're living on islands. They don't even know that they're close to the water, which turned out to be absolute nonsense, because actually, not only did they have a real proximate and intimate connection with the water around them, they were in touch with an ancestral knowledge of water. These were young people who had come from the Dominican Republic, from Guinea-Bissau, from Vietnam, from quite literally all across the world, and people who brought with them those global stories. Like I said about those subplots, we actually had a task to do, which was to design an exhibition. And we gave ourselves one design constraint, reminiscent of that design constraint from the very first project that we ever did, which is that we were going to work with only the materials that were there when we started, only the materials that were in the exhibition before us. And that meant many, many different kind of problems, one of which is that I hate this color of lilac. And so we were left with this exhibition to do, and everyone was very happy and thinking about climate justice and blah, blah, blah. But actually, it turned out to be an extremely difficult task. And we set aside doing this by trying to lay out the flood plan of Wilhelmsburg and then mapping the exhibition based on that work. We then worked with the curatorial team, and there should be some stuff in these little bits as well, by which we were also working with the conservation of those objects and thinking about how we could turn the museum into a hydrological feature of the watershed. We were inspired always by these things that we were seeing around us, and the flood markers around Wilhelmsburg we took particularly inspiration from in trying to seek an upwards motion, a verticality in terms of the spatial orientation of the exhibition. We then curated a series of islands that told the stories of the objects and also the activist material through which people could meander on the exhibition floor. And we worked very, very closely with a group called BI Elminsel, who are an alternative youth education facilitator within Wilhelmsburg. And they were responsible for making the design, for making the aesthetic. And we chose to make that aesthetic out of redaction. So we tried to take something new by redacting something old. It was a way of kind of producing the new from taking away. And this then informed the graphic language of the entire project, and also the eventual kind of outlook of the space, which ended up becoming the space through which we could meander through, to flow through, a space by which our bodies were physical participants within the exhibition and within this story of water. Just like everything with these subplots, they found a way of rearing their heads, and we were able to fire up the clay messages from before, as I said, from the young people, and actually leave them within the vitrines in these spaces. So whilst meandering and looking through these 1,000-year-old objects sometimes, you could also see these 5-month-old clay messages left by the young people from Wilhelmsburg. The exhibition has just been deinstalled by our friends and fellows out there in Zinberka, and we're going to be working with them next year to turn the whole exhibition into furniture for the school canteen for the youths that we're working with. And now I'm 2 minutes over, so I'm going to stop.
Right. Amazing. Thank you so much. That was incredible. So, I have frantically been trying to kind of pull some commonalities and some discussion points that we can discuss across. So, there is something both Akil and Jayden you talked about, which was, Jayden, you said network of collaborations bigger than our practice, and Akil talked about ecology of practices. And I think it would be really great to have a bit of an expansion, and maybe Julia also with the youth, that might also come into that kind of notion of a more relational idea of an expansion of a practice rather than everything being within the boundaries of one practice. It would be great to kind of hear from you a bit more about that, potentially, any of you.
Okay. I jump in, because you've done a lot of talking. I mean, it's so remarkable to see your presentations. I feel so honored to be on the stage with you in awe. I think really, from our perspective, our real concern is for people, right? And how people structure their lives and come together to therefore construct space. What they're interested in. And therefore, the practice being bigger than us is about bringing people into that conversation. But in order to bring them in, you have to expand what the notion is of architecture, especially in these hallowed halls. We don't necessarily see it as the kind of, as you can see from our work, it's not necessarily just it's not held hostage by the physical or the material. It extends to the immaterial, the fleeting, the impermanent, the way in which we converse with someone, the way in which we trade, the way in which we greet each other, the way in which we cook for each other. And once you do that and you expand the notion, then all of a sudden everyone can become collaborators in that as a practice. But, it's not necessarily being held hostage by your RIBA membership or your ARB accreditation. So that's why I mainly talk about the practice being Architects Plus, because I really love the fact that everybody does something else. And they do something else which isn't conventionally architecture, because that allows for those kind of overlaps and those kind of unknown consequences. That means that we're in constant dialogue with other fissures that are taking place in the world around us, and therefore we're trying to make sense of that all the time. It's like a gateway, if you like.
Do you guys have anything to add? Or?
I mean, I think I'm coming from a very different space in that they're both running practices, and I work within a university, which I think changes at the rate of retirement. So, but I think my theory is that, well, my working theory is that it's really hard actually to sustain engagement. I think your practices do, because it's like your MO, and I'm just thinking more broadly about the profession. And one of the things that I would love this idea that universities are actually almost uniquely placed to sustain what can be 2-4 year long projects. I mean, because the commitment, I'm assuming, goes well beyond what you're paid to do. And the second, and equally, we should be paid for, all of us should be paid for our labor always. And so I think for me, that kind of bringing out is actually this thing, what happens when knowledge is held elsewhere. And so one of the things that we do, which I think is really important, so when we finish a project, of all the findings and the kind of recommendations for, let's say, a local plan, we give those presentations to young people. Not all of them will do it, but in Crewe, for example, one of our young researchers has presented 3 times in like local meetings and town halls, and that's kind of the aim. And it doesn't mean that everyone has to do it. And I think and when that happens, I think we begin to imagine new forms. I was just looking at that of what co-design could look like, because I think we need to radically change these spaces. And I think you're both beginning to show us what that can look like. Yeah. But to normalize that and to make it sort of more mainstream, I think we really need more expansive ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose this is also something we've kind of grappled with, and I find interesting in that if you're, again, looking horizontally, if you're going horizontally then vertically, then you can actually just have numerous collaborators rather than grow the organization bigger and bigger and bigger because, whatever that, society says we have to grow. So I suppose this comes from the public works, and it might be interesting because we have 12 directors and no employees because we just work with with others. Well, we have kind of some employees, but only 1 or 2. But they're project by project basis. But I think that it's not a perfect system. But I think if you start to think collaborating with younger practices for them to also grow and for them to also develop, so you're kind of creating this support structure, and that's why I really liked what you both said about that, because it becomes around a collaborative care of a kind of spreading. So it is communities, but I don't know how constant they are. So there's also different rates of collaboration, because there could be those that you collaborate for 20 years with, and those that are a bit more fleeting because that's how long a project is. And so I think that is really interesting to almost kind of, that's why I think it's a design process to develop these collectivities, and I really loved you saying that. And then I just want to go to Julia's citizen control for a minute, and then see how we can talk about that a little bit, because in a way this notion of power and how it's, we've been talking about this stuff for so long, but actually the act of giving up power or to share power is a really hard thing. So the actual talking about it is actually easy, So if you're dealing with local authority, you've seen it in the institution. So if you're talking to local authority and you say, well, actually, could you just give us this piece of land because it's going to be for a community land trust, they'll kind of tell you to shove off, no? So because they want to retain the power, right? So I think that power is a fantastic conversation to have, but I think it has to happen all the time. Has to happen at management level, has to happen in practice level. It has to and I think if we start to think of it as more relational, that it just has to flow. Everybody should have power and be able to be powerless at different times, potentially within a project. And that, in a really concrete way, could be that you're with policymakers, but then you're shoveling, the earth, or, taking clay out. So in a way, I think it's really good to have a chat about that, because you're also really looking at counterpower. So I think it might be quite nice to kind of have a little bit of a fleshing out.
Do you want to comment on counterpower?
I'll comment on counterpower. Again, I'll comment on counterpower. Because I also believe in disempowerment. Who am I looking at in this room? Who needs to be disempowered? You are. I'm joking. In that, I think that Julia is completely right in terms of how you articulate a collaboration without power is really speaking about nothing. And that's also why I like that term co-conspiracy, because it's with an acknowledgement that we're talking about shifting a dominant power. I'm not talking about collaboration for the just generic sake of collaboration. I collaborate with the government when I pay my taxes. You know what I mean? There is no valency in collaboration unless we are talking about power. And actually, within that context of power and with equity, there are also many people who are being actively disempowered. And then there are very, very few who hold all the power. And these are things that everyone knows, and I'm not going to continue to rub on about, and also we always talk about. But I think in terms of, to go back to the ecology as well and how we do that collectively, I think a lot of us have experienced situations by which we've reached points by which we're thinking, we can't go any further than this. Yeah. We're bashing our heads against this. We've been saying the same old thing, same old thing, same old thing. And there's no way by which we can do that individually. But as a collective expression, I think that there has been huge swathes that have worked and that have changed the discourse around architecture, around the built environment, etc. And sometimes it feels like the kind of Sisyphean task to continuously try and do this. But there really is an onus and an urgent one now to think radically about who we are disempowering. Not even just who are we empowering, but who are we taking the power from.
Thank you. Julia, do you have anything to add? Or?
No, I think I love that. Yeah.
Okay.
Keep questions coming.
Can I jump in on the power front, because it's so interesting to hear you talk about sharing power and your counterpower and your disempowerment. And in our world we talk about kind of just challenging power. I think it's the core thread that runs through all of our work, and is why we have this kind of cultural device, because it empowers us to speak about that and to confront people in a certain space. But what I really love about all of our practices is that to challenge power, you have to kind of recognize power. And I think the way that we recognize power is across the entire spectrum of where power sits. And that's across the entire spectrum of architecture. So sometimes it is about the simple act of occupation and being in a space and holding that space, and being here in this room is already kind of hopefully a challenge in some ways. But I do think that architecture as a discourse exists across that spectrum, and sometimes we do need to challenge the permanent structures that also embolden and empower others. And so in that way, we are trying to challenge the physical structures as well as the kind of immaterial structures. And I think that's a real frontier. I think because we lack privilege in that space. We lack the material resource to produce. We lack the capital wealth to build. I think that's a frontier in which we can challenge power as much as the kind of immaterial, kind of soft, more fleeting stuff as well. And so it's just it's the lens of power in which you're kind of attacking, which is important.
I think also, we started to do power mapping in projects. So it was really interesting because this was part of a kind of community engagement as part of I won't talk about it, but But it was, all of the community was saying, oh, the architects have so much power. And so I started to do the kind of mapping of a statutory consultation model of who has power. And then I did the ways we were doing through public art, like over 9 months period, and it was just much more dissipated. And actually, you saw the relational power there, because you started to see that actually at one point community had much more power than even the developer. So it's in so much, it can be very nuanced, and you start to see that. So it's in terms of what you're saying, Jayden, around the lenses, and I think that's what I'm talking about in terms of the disempowerment has to be part of that struggle. And I think, but that's the thing, we have to include that as part of our palettes.
That's why I spent so much time on the Equalities Act, because understanding a sort of a legislative framework in which we're all operating and working in, and understanding sort of how national policy does actually really influence what a site around your corner will look like. And I think that's a really important thing to engage with.
No, absolutely. And I think, this is a bit of a curveball, but I suppose the other really interesting concept around the Equalities Act is also thinking about transformational justice, which is much more nuanced,
I think we probably all grapple with this thing of like incremental change versus that transformational change and systemic stuff. Because I think it's so easy to kind of feel completely overwhelmed by the larger systemic stuff. But I do believe, I think maybe I have to believe in the smaller incremental changes can be part of a progressive future.
I'd like to open up to the audience.
Thank you so much for your banging presentations, really, really fab. I want to ask a very specific question, which I think relates to all three of your presentations, which is what do we do about the police? Because it felt like, although you didn't mention it, the police and the power of the police in urban design kind of like ran through all of your programs. So, Jayden, you're talking about Notting Hill Carnival, celebrating Trinidadian culture. Notting Hill, obviously, massively, infamously over-policed every single year. Julia, talking about how do you make space for young people. That is made so much harder by the police weighing into the planning process and saying, oh, we can't have that, that will encourage antisocial behavior. The only mention of young people in the police's secured by design guidance for housing is when they say that if you're going to have a space for young people, it must be surveilled. That's their only mention of young people in that whole program. And your bench surrounded by nothing, 100% that came from a police officer's suggestion. They actually have a line in that where they're like, have you considered single seats set several meters apart? And then Akil, obviously you're talking about Ramallah, one of the most over-policed places in the world, but also Brixton with its own history of very heavy-handed policing. I imagine a lot of the communities you're working with, their ability to carve out space and feel safe is made harder every day by these people. So, the RIBA endorses all this secured by design stuff, by the way. There's CPD programs with an RIBA logo on it and a police badge next to it. So my question is, what do we do about the police?
We abolish them.
I avoid them.
My opinion is probably not even worth taking into account, but that is what I believe, and I'm happy for people not to believe that. To go on to Finn's point, like when me personally, and like Jayden as well, so our practice Resolve, we don't work with the police. We don't just work in South London, we're from South London. So I grew up being stopped and searched by the police every day on the way from school. I've been violently assaulted by police, I've been put in jail, I've been put in the back of police vans, etc., etc., etc. So I have a visceral reaction when it comes to police. But the people that we work around have that same reaction. And so for that reason, we avoid that. In terms of how we structure those things, actually, Ruth Wilson Gilmore said it very, very well in terms of how we need to think about abolition and how that's also a process towards how we do those things. Whoever was on the marches recently would know that when there aren't that many police, you don't have that much crime. And really that there are ways in which we can decenter where prohibited justice comes from in society, and that these things aren't even that radical, that people have done it before. And that places in America, of all places, have also kind of trialed those things out. So I think that actually, and this comes back to how we also think collectively, there are ways in which we can collectively challenge these norms that we can't individually. Resolve not doing anything with the police doesn't mean anything to anyone, no one cares, right? But if we're all actually challenging how that's being evolved as a collective practice, as a collective endeavor, then we start to make some things. And actually, perhaps us sitting in RIBA also gives us means that we have an onus to start putting some pressure on this lot to start doing something.
My response is a pitch for a project. I never thought of myself as the entrepreneurial type, but maybe I am. And I think, secure by design, and I think, Finn, you've written brilliantly about it, and I actually get most of the young people I work with to read your article about it, because they see these processes happening, and that's one of the most vicious ways in which young people are designed out is through secure by design. I've experienced it in our project, we experienced it. And for me, I would love to, and I keep on trying to get funding, because I think the knowledge that informs that piece of policy is, I've tried to find where's the survey data, where is this stuff coming from, and I believe it's just being cooked up in some room in the middle of nowhere. And so my response is saying, well, actually, this is a tool and a method by which we can have the production of knowledge to shape those policies. And I would desperately love someone to commission me to work with young people in those areas and to write that policy with them, and to have, and to be shaped by some sort of genuine experience. And that's again where I think the university can play a role, to actually have some real data and real evidence to back up a policy, because you won't find that data. And if it comes from a very sort of narrow lens. And so I think, I would love to do that body of work, because I think it's so desperately needed.
Thank you so much. Any other? Yep, there are two questions here.
Cheers, thank you. I appreciate that for the amazing speech. I realized that all of you have quite a massive interest in project related to the community and a culture, which is great. For example, like the Bristol and your benches. So my question is, what is the good balance, and what's the way to find a project which is beneficial for the practice, or a particular project like yours, from the business perspective, but still have a benefit influence for the culture? Is there any way to balance these two? What do you think about it?
So can you repeat the question?
So the question is how you can find the balance between these two to make a project which is still influential and benefit to your practice from a business perspective, or just to focus on the culture thing.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Is that clear to you?
I have a quick observation around that, is that I think we have such a distrust in our institutions and our government that developers are highly incentivized to actually talk to people just to get their projects through. Because there is like a visceral dislike to development broadly anywhere in this country. And it's actually stopping things that probably should happen from happening. And so I think on that basis, just to repair some trust between the various bodies that get stuff physically done. I also think it does make good business sense. It's not good business sense to build things that are destructive to the environment. It just simply isn't. It's a con that it is. And so, one of my clients is actually a sort of a long-term pension fund, and they recognize that as a business model, it's in their interest to design a place that actually works and that's actually loved. So that's a kind of just a short, kind of observation that I have. I think it costs money to do things badly in the long run.
Maybe if I can answer just to say, I feel like it costs money to do things properly in the short term, as well, because I think the diagram you showed of the RIBA plan of work is an accurate diagram. And actually, the investment in that early collaborative process often comes down to the practice. I loved what you were saying about the subplot. Like, what are we trying to do? Yeah, I think it's a great thing. But I suppose what we try to do is just to be really upfront about it as well. And just say, like, we want to do this, because I can't be asked trying to convince you to do it afterwards. We want to do it, and we think it should be done like this. And And if you want to give us a job to do it like this, we'll happily do it if that's the case. I couldn't tell you that it makes much business sense, as my cash flow would attest, but, you know.
Maybe, can I just say one thing? I think there are different forms of capital. So it's not just financial capital in a way, and also, so there is natural human, which is educational, there's, cultural, social, which is around social networks. So in a way, I think it's also, if we're talking really holistically about what makes sense, I think we need to map all those things. And on the other hand, there's also the communities you work with are very, they can't also put time in necessarily. So actually when Akil talks about ecologies, it's also that the economic ecology is also broader than just the practice. So one has to think about, who are you paying out there? And so I think it's a really good question, but I think it's much wider than just the architectural practice.
Can I just say something in response to that as well? Because obviously, I'm a huge fan of your practice and the way in which you look at value. But I do think, and I can only speak from a personal perspective, that there is a risk if it doesn't make conventional financial sense to do the work, that the labor exists in the people who have been historically disempowered. Yeah. So, we definitely subscribe to like a broader definition of value across the board, and the broader definition of value that can be shared amongst various different communities and collaborators. But we do need to address how we run a practice that can have those values, and as you know, it's a challenge.
No, it's a real challenge.
But just like economically, what crashed the economic housing market was seeing housing only as a number, seeing it as that sort of awful business, and not seeing it as a system. So the thing that crashes it isn't our work, So like that's the the straight up numbers.
I just thank you. Can we just have the other? Oh, there's more coming up. We can probably do 2 more questions. You can fight amongst yourselves. no collaboration here.
Thank you to all for the presentation. I think it was really interesting to see how you're all dealing with the same problem in different disciplines. But I'm curious. I know you touched on it towards the end of the presentation, Julia. But I'm wondering if there's any framework that any of you use to engage with communities, and similar to what you were mentioning about the RIBA plan of work, if there is any existing framework that people who are in disciplines that want to kind of engage with communities, but maybe they're concerned about the bureaucracy of councils and things like that. Whether any of you had any frameworks that you use.
I mean, I'm going to give you what might sound like a really cop-out answer, but I think I was, just as an anecdote, when I was first starting my work in India, which was, I didn't realize at the time I was getting a sort of hardcore training in basically participatory design processes, which I then reactively read about, from UCL Press and stuff. I didn't realize at the time that's what I was doing. And so when I was doing that work, I went to a talk by an author who'd written this marvelous book about a kind of a story of a death in an Indian slum. And I use that word so that everyone can understand what I'm talking about. And she said that her work was underpinned by this idea of being willing to listen to the less powerful and be willing to stay for a while. And I think those 2 guiding principles will get you through good community engagement. There are loads of toolkits and things like that and frameworks, and I don't know, I think you maybe need to make your own. I don't believe that there's a generic way to work with people because we are so complex and so different. But I think if you guide yourself by this idea of genuinely listening and be willing to stay for a while, that might outlive the project and the time that you're paid to be there, I think then you're on the right track. I'm sorry if that sounds like a cop-out.
No. That's a great answer, thank you.
I don't know if you want to add. I mean, you both,
Nothing, that was a great answer.
So, yes, we had this lady here first. Last one.
Hi, thank you very much. So I come from a construction, logistics and planning background, Clarissa. Nice to meet you all. Great presentation. I made notes, but I'm just going to vibe off the top of my head. But you mentioned, Akil, about materials being traces of power, lines of power. And you mentioned as well about them being a resource for the wealthy and kind of there needing to be a way that the people who are disempowered, who don't have access to that resource, can somehow still be part of the conversation. And so it's just an open question, really, but how does then your relationship with the construction industry or transportation kind of interact with that? Because from just my experience, they're quite different. They don't seem to understand each other, even though they work alongside each other all the time. And I find myself kind of having to speak fluent in both, and just interested to know what your experiences are.
Yeah,
Any?
I can go. It might not be the best answer in the world. I think that because we occupy quite a strange place in which we're mostly constructing things ourselves. And on the rare occasions that we do work with contractors, we're also fortunate enough to work with construction workers and kind of groups that we're very, very close with, so we can kind of have that close tie, which allows us to keep this focus on material and the political history of materials as well, because we're scavenging. All the time we're genuinely scavenging. So the people that I see the most when we're doing material work are travelers and people who are it's us and people who are looking around for materials. So when you're on that journey, you're confronted by a different sector of society, not a static sector of society, people who are mobile and dynamic and actually who are moving from place to place. And it's really interesting, but then that's probably not the answer that you want to hear, but that's kind of how we interact with the material. I think actually on a wider scale, we've taken a step back from larger capital projects because we don't have a hold over materials in the way that we'd like. We're trying to approach it from a slightly new angle and actually thinking about, we're based in Croydon, outside of the back of Central, and we're looking for a range of different kind of philanthropic and third sector funds around establishing a material store, which is a way of approaching the circular economy, but with a place-based approach within Croydon, to understand what that means also for local skills. So how do we deliver buildings at these kind of at a commercial scale, also at kind of area-wide scale, but also by appraising people's ability to work with those local materials. So we're trying to do kind of stage zero work because we found ourselves very often within normal frames of architectural work unstuck.
Well, I'm happy to provide some input later on about how you get hold of resources if you need. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you we've run over, but I suppose just closing remarks. I think what gives me a lot of joy seeing these projects really is that these types of practices, whether you want to call them architecture or not, have become part of now architectural history and discourse. And I think that's really uplifting for me, because in the 1990s, when you talked about it, people looked like you've just given them lime to suck. So I think that's absolutely wonderful. So I want to really thank again the RIBA and VitrA Bathrooms for this event, and for you, the amazing audience and our amazing speakers. So please give them another round of applause.